So my name is Ben. I'm with this little company you might have heard of called Gartner. I don't do magic quadrants though. I'm not into magical thinking, so try not to throw too many darts at me like a dartboard. Talk here, we're going to talk about risk management, risk assessment, risk analysis. I threw the word cyber in there because you got to. And I'll reserve the cyber jokes for this part of the heckling crowd right over here. So feel free to toss out questions along the way here. This is what I call a skip the appetizers and entrees, go straight to dessert talk. So these are the 5 recommendations right off the bat. Can anybody see these? No, probably not. I'm going to step back a little bit so I can actually see my deck too. So we did research end of last year, early this year, and we talked to a lot of people and we said, okay, you're doing risk assessment, doing risk analysis, what frameworks are you using, what tools are you using, and how do you actually get down to being effective at what you're trying to do here. And these are the 5 recommendations that we ended up having at the end. And so rather than go through like all the really boring research and talk about the stuff that doesn't get you anywhere necessarily, I just wanted to jump right into this stuff and say, okay, you probably have requirements to do risk management, IT risk management, or technical risk management in your organizations. And you may have questions of how to make that better. You may have questions of where to start. We get that a lot. And so, let's just tackle this. How many of you do risk assessment or risk analysis on a regular basis? How many of you are maybe an auditor type folks? How many of you are more like IT infrastructure? How many of you are developers? A couple of you. I feel like I'm getting a kind of a buzz off of the mic here, so forgive me. What else did I miss? Management. Anybody management here? I'll use smaller words, okay. All right. Did I miss any big topics? Okay, so industry-wise, financial services, should be a couple folks. Education, probably a few of you. No education here? We're at VCU for crying out loud, come on. Education doesn't need it, right? What else? Manufacturing. Oh, wow, look at that. Well, forget about the vendors. I don't care about the vendors, Dan. What else do we need? There's lots of other. Healthcare. There's no healthcare down in Richmond, is there? State government, any state government here in the room? The lone person willing to raise her hand. Appreciate that, thank you, thank you. All right, so good healthy mix here. Really appreciate that. Not that you can read it because it's in very small print at the bottom, but you can ping me if you're actually interested in the report. I can point you at the number there for it. Okay, let's get some energy going. I'm feeling kind of flat up here. Come on, get going. So was lunch good? Was the barbecue decent? Was it the same guys as last year? I couldn't tell or not. No, different from last year? Last year was better or worse? It's all the same. This was better. Okay, this is good. All right. Where's Jake? Vote of confidence. Okay, cool. All right. Did you guys get cookies? Was there any sugar in there at all? Did you get your sodas? I know we're not supposed to drink soda anymore because it's bad for you, but you need the sugar. Come on, wake up. All right. Caffeine. There was definitely caffeine in those cans too. I saw that too. All right. So first and foremost, if you're trying to get underway with risk assessment, risk analysis, you got to have some process in place. And you're all probably like, what? No way, man. But with process comes this very important thing called context. And ironically, context is what we end up missing. And sorry, it's a bit of an eye chart, hard to see up here, but context is the one thing that we tend to skip over a lot of the time, especially when we approach risk from a technical organization's perspective. In the corner here, roughly, if you could see it, is the diagram from ISO 31000. Anybody familiar with ISO 31000? So it's a guideline for how to do risk management generically. If you look at this, you'll notice the top box there is labeled context. Guess what we don't typically do 9 times out of 10 in a lot of risk assessment activity or risk management processes? We don't do context setting, which is kind of problematic. Because if you notice, context then feeds into risk assessment, which then feeds into your risk treatment or risk remediation program. A word on terminology before I go any more on this. So risk management is your overall process. It's really about decisions, right? Let's make good decisions, make better decisions. Risk assessment is the process of taking the context and then mashing that up essentially with some analysis capabilities to say, okay, what are we actually seeing in this given scenario? What are the actual details of this? And then how does that map back to my risk tolerance, my risk capacity, my risk appetite, especially from like an investment perspective. Do I have an appetite to take on more risk because there might be upside? And then all of that comes together in that last box there, evaluation as a substep under assessment, and then feeds into, okay, now what do I do with this? What treatment plan do I come up with for risk? So that's your overall risk management program. You'll notice here, let's see if I can use the magic red dot, assessment then is step 2 in this risk management process. It is not step 1. So you read all these regulatory requirements such as PCI DSS. You must do risk assessment. You must make risk-based decisions. Well, that's all good and fine, but if you don't have the context that establishes that the sensitivities for your organization, the priorities for your organization, and some of the business impact information, good luck with the risk assessment, because you're going to be missing 50% or more of the actual data that you need to make a good informed decision. Also then notice that risk analysis falls as a component step under risk assessment. And I'm a stickler for terminology. I like getting the words right because I think words are important and have meaning. And so oftentimes I will stop people and say, okay, you're using the word risk, but you're describing a threat, or you're describing a weakness or vulnerability. What do you really mean? Because if you're talking about risk, where was the analysis? Where's the assessment? Did you account for the impact of the business? These things oftentimes fall out of these conversations, and especially, unfortunately, within the technical security crowd, we tend to be really bad at this. We're like, if you go through the vendor hall, every single vendor in there is probably going to throw the word risk at you. But, sorry, vuln scanners are not generally talking about risk. They're talking about vulnerability, right? And they might try to tell you that it's risk intelligence. Sure, okay, so you're talking about factors that go into your overall assessment and analysis capabilities, but it doesn't really match up. So again, the key kind of takeaway point here is that we have to understand this overall process framework and these key components. Now, putting it into practice, it could end up looking something like this. So this is a draft of a guidance framework that we're working on right now that kind of takes that ISO 31000 model and puts it together. And what I want to highlight here, a couple things right up front. One is gathering the requirements when you start doing a risk assessment, right? So again, it's pulling in that context information as well as defining the scenario that you're doing the analysis against. And then structuring for success. One of the first things we like to talk about is doing a triage. We could talk about qualitative, we could talk about quantitative, we could talk about frameworks, blah, blah, blah. But first and foremost, you should be making a snap decision. How, at a gut level, how important, how sensitive is this project? Or is this scenario? Are we dealing with credit card data, healthcare records, or are we just dealing with brochureware off of a website? You should be able to intuitively make a decision based off of a quick triage capability, and we'll talk about this later, as to how you should route things and how much time and energy you should invest in things. And then notice here in our process structure at the bottom, there actually tend to be 3 different types of risk assessments that you will often perform within your organization. What we most often see is this one on the far right here, portfolio assessment. Those are your annual risk assessments. Guess what? Those tend to have the least amount of value overall. And you say, well, that can't be true, Ben, because we just did this risk assessment and it uncovered all sorts of stuff in our organization. Okay, that's probably true, but what I'm here to tell you is that you should actually be doing smaller risk assessments on an ongoing basis for almost all of your projects, and at regular check marks throughout the year, and rolling that up into your annualized assessment, because the last thing the business needs is more surprises. As Target is probably very happy to tell you after reading Brian Krebs' article in the November-December timeframe. Oh, by the way, Target, you have a breach. I'm hearing it from the banks. Why haven't you told us yet? Oops. And you get through that through ad hoc assessments, and then we also talk about toll gate assessments in this framework. Toll gates would be, so you got a formalized project, maybe you're going through an SDLC process or an operational development lifecycle process. You can usually have actual toll gates in there where you can say, oh, hold on, do a risk assessment. Or procurement. How many of you are dealing with outsourcing to cloud providers today? Is that a bit of a headache for you? How many of you have dealt with procurement decisions being made external to the IT organization or to the security organization that, yeah, put your data at risk, and you're like, wait a minute, time out there, why are you doing that? Did you actually consider the ramifications of your decision here? No. And so what you end up having to do is you end up having to go back to your procurement process and saying, dear procurement, when making IT decisions, thou shalt involve IT risk management, unless, of course, you want to lose your job in the business and be on the street. But, you know, that goes without saying. But this is all great to get the horse back in the barn after the barn's burned down, but, you know, minor technicality. But these are the kind of challenges we're dealing with, and that's where toll gates really come into play. Is it can be very valuable to identify your key business processes and plug into those. And the key here with that phrasing is plugging into those instead of making people come to you, because that's where the failure occurs. If you tell people that they have to change what they're doing, oftentimes that's where the process breakdown occurs. So that's very key with your processes and with your alignment. One other thing to consider here from a contextual perspective is your context as it comes in will also help define for you what your context should look like going out. And we have a lot of bad output within this industry in particular. Risk scoring, and I don't see him sitting in here, but CVSS, our favorite whipping boy for scoring, right? You know, oh, your CVSS score is a 7, therefore you must go patch it. Oh, it's only a 5.6, okay, don't worry about it, that's a medium, whatever that means. So there's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of tools out there that are happy to give you a magical number. Your risk is 72. Or you get the report and it's a list of, I have, you know, 10 high risk findings and, you know, 40 medium risk findings and 5 billion low risk findings that I won't care about, so gone. But what does it mean? Where's the context? And you start digging at it, you start picking at that and drilling down and you're like, I don't think you mean risk when you're saying risk. It's like that scene out of Princess Bride. You keep using that word, I do not think it means what you think it means, right? You got to put some context behind it, right? Okay, external consultant, you say that this is a high-risk finding. Can you please explain to me what the business impact is? Oh, I'm sorry, it's just a vulnerability scan output. Did you actually validate that? Because, you know, as a pen tester, that's what we're paying you for is the manual validation, not the running of the tool, right? Silly me. Anyway, these are the things we got to ask, right, in terms of contextualizing. Because, by the way, if you, AppSec tools, we just did some research on AppSec, and so this is top of my mind, but AppSec tools are a great example where you get a bunch of results and you throw the report at the developers, and the developers go, bite me, right? That was cleaned up a little bit for the kids in the room, right? But, you know, you take this out-of-band report that has no context, no meaning for them whatsoever, and then you drop it in their laps like an atomic bomb, and it's like, and then you run away giggling. Auditors like to do this too, by the way, right? So I came through and checked out your controls, and I think that you have some weaknesses in your control structure. You need to address these here, here, and here. You know, you have NT in your environment. You know, it's not networked, but it's still NT, so that must be a high-risk finding. I love to see our security community as they pass through airports, and they look at non-networked devices, and then they mock them for being of older OS generations. You know, that thing's vulnerable to auto-run attack. Yes, but there's no input ports. So maybe look at the context a little bit more. Okay, enough of that. I'm going to run out of time if I keep going at this pace, right? 3 examples here, you may not be able to read them. So the first one I put up here is your risk is 72. What does that mean? Nobody knows. Your risk is high. Again, what does that mean? We can even get to these, you know, a likely loss of $500,000 to $1 million. Now, I'm a big fan of quantitative risk analysis. I love FAIR. But that statement there doesn't tell me anything. How did you define likely? What's the probability? Did you actually look at the probability? And by the way, there is one thing that comes out of this, though, that is beneficial and different from the previous 2, which is using a range. If you were to look at me and say, and I were to ask you, how tall am I? What's your gut income? How tall do you think I am, sir? You're the wrong guy to ask. Can you translate that into inches for these? No standard units? 1.02 meters. Go home. Yeah, right. So here's the thing. They're all wrong. Why are they all wrong? Because they used a point value. So unless you're standing with a tape measure can actually measure me, your point value is probably not going to get very accurate. We want to use ranges, okay? Because you know that I'm probably taller than 4 feet, and I'm probably shorter than 8 feet. That's an accurate range that my height falls into. Now, it's not very precise. And so precision is the secondary attribute that we want to go towards when we use these ranges, right? And then we can assign confidence values and things like that. Very exciting stuff, I know. You can just tell it. The number of people are like, woohoo! But I would far rather you say, you know, Ben is 4 to 8 feet tall than to say he's 6 foot tall and be wrong. And let's put this into business value when you go and you present to your C-level and to your board. Dear board, I think there's a 90% chance of this happening. It didn't happen. Therefore, you're wrong and you look bad. Okay? We think, you know, there's a 70 to 90% chance of this happening. It didn't happen. Okay, it was still greater than 50%, but we also now bookend that within a time period and maybe say 5 years. Okay, well now you can build some credibility around that. Now you can pull in some data, really bolster that. And so using those ranges can help kind of lend you credibility. So that's very important too. One last point on process stuff before you all fall into your sleeps completely bored to death. Process is cool. It's important for repeatability, but don't get mired down into it in such detail that you end up killing yourselves in the process, right? If your process is 4,000 steps long and takes you months to complete, you might want to reconsider. The other thing about process is process is great for transparency if you put it into a language and a mechanism that allows for transparency. So if you use tools, if you publish it, because if management comes out and says, what you doing? And you say, I'm doing the risk assessment process. And they don't understand what that means and they have no idea of how to go about understanding what that means, you probably are going to have some additional questions to answer there. So that raises the question, where do you start? Hey, Ben, I was told I need to do risk assessment. What do I do? Well, process first. That's always a good starting point. And then you got to start operationalizing it. This eye chart is from our research, and it looks at some of the common frameworks that are out there today. And the two things we're looking at here in blue is ramp-up time, so how long it takes to go from nothing to the completion of the first assessment. And then we'll call it yellowish green, spring green, there we go, very spring green, seems appropriate this time of year, is cycle time. So once you have your process in place, how long does it take to do subsequent iterations through that process to complete results? Anybody notice anything here in particular? COBIT 5 is a bit of an outlier. Anybody looked at COBIT 5 before? COBIT 5 for risk? Yeah, it's kind of big, isn't it? Rather thorough. So there's an interesting correlation here, is that the ones that have the longest ramp-up time typically also imply that you really need to get somebody who is very intimately familiar with that framework in order to customize it to your organization. Because there's so much behind it, and it takes a long time. And COBIT is hands down the most thorough and most complete of all the frameworks, for better and for worse. You probably may not be able to see it at the very bottom. FAIR, we have a moderate ramp-up time, very short turnaround. It's a bit of an unfair comparison because FAIR is a risk analysis tool, not a risk assessment process or framework, okay? Just want to highlight that there. But the key here is when you start sitting down to say, okay, make my process, what am I going to do for risk assessment? What am I going to do for risk analysis? You need to have this thought in mind. How much time can you afford to take in building that process and building that overall approach? Because if you think you can afford to spend 6 to 12 months doing that, okay, great, that's fine. I would argue that you could probably accomplish way more in those 6 months if you focus on something less robust just to get some results. RiskSafe is up there. That one is a SaaS-based, tool-based framework. Literally, it's a questionnaire-driven one. And so there isn't much ramp-up time and there isn't much cycle time because you go in and you do initial population of your data, your context information in terms of appetite and capacity, and then you just run through essentially a questionnaire type thing. Now, the flip side is it's a very lightweight qualitative assessment, and your value may vary pretty widely. And there's a lot of assumptions that get covered up in a lot of that stuff. So, key takeaway here is starting someplace, picking a framework is a good approach, but you have to understand things that attributes about the frameworks, and such as the ramp-up time and startup time, or cycle time. There are a lot of errors and misconceptions. We talked about estimation and correlation, calibration already. So really avoid those point values, heavily leverage off of using ranges. You can assign ranges to labels, and it's fine. That's a qualitative assessment. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, for triage purposes, it's actually very advantageous to do that. But it's also important to make sure you go through a couple calibration exercises to make sure your ranges make sense. Has anybody read How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard? I highly recommend that book if you're going to do risk assessment activities and risk analysis. It's a great book on that focuses a lot of its attention on how to do estimation and correlation. Or estimation and calibration. We'll get the word right one of these times. One of the other common errors here is inadequate business input. So unless you are actively working in the business units themselves and dealing with business decisions and business losses, business gains on a daily basis, you are probably not going to do a very good job of estimating business impact. Techies are notorious for overestimating a lot of negatives. And the big one, of course, is reputation. Oh, we're going to have a breach and then our reputation will be shot and we'll all be out of work. Guess what? With the exception of Target, that generally isn't true. In fact, many organizations that had significant breaches are back to trading at or above the levels that they were trading at before. So a breach does not necessarily have significant impact on reputation over the long term. You might have unwanted attention in the short term, but we got to keep those estimates around negative impacts reasonable, and going and talking to the business is really key. It's just really hard to, if you're not connected with the daily operational things, to really get those estimates right. Bad assumptions and garbage in, garbage out. This is a theme that you will see throughout the rest of this deck. Gigo is a big problem. If you make an assumption and you make an assumption and they're completely different assumptions, your analyses are going to be different. And now if you go back and try to talk to somebody in the back of the room and you're comparing notes and you all work from different assumptions or undocumented assumptions, this can cause a lot of problems, right? This goes back to that context problem too, right? Context setting is really key and assumptions tie into that. Oops. Gaming the system. Every framework, every methodology, every process is going to be susceptible to a degree of gaming of the system. It's just inherent property. The goal is not to remove all subjectivity towards the mythical objectivity, which doesn't exist. Subjectivity is a spectrum, okay? It's not a binary condition. And so there will always be a degree of subjectivity, and that's okay. So if you read a lot of the modern research from guys like Kahneman, you'll find that actually your intuition, your intuitive reaction to things tends to be pretty accurate and pretty reliable, right? So if we ignore that to a degree, that can be problematic. But if we listen to it too much and go against facts and data, you know, we have to watch out for that. And that's where gaming the system can come into play. Some examples where I've seen gaming of the system, not necessarily specific to risk assessment though, bug tracking reward programs internally to organizations. Hey developers, if you find bugs in your code, you'll get a bonus. A couple people laughed over that because they realized that the developers then just introduced bugs into their code and then magically found the bugs in their code and then got a bonus. Or reducing your bug count numbers too, that's another one, right? So, wow, my code's really buggy today. Oh, wait, tomorrow I fixed it all at 100% resolve rate, so I get a bonus, except that, you know, those numbers were all skewed. Last one there, use of math magic. So one of the biggest problems with qualitative approaches is that people never settle for just doing a qualitative approach. They like to take their labels and then assign them numerical values and then do all sorts of weird mathematical computations. Now it's one thing to do kind of a matrix-based approach where, you know, on a scale from 1 to 10 this, a scale of 1 to 10 that, you add them up, okay, fine. Get some numbers, you can put that into a matrix type approach. That's not a problem. Heat map it, whatever you want to talk about. The really weird stuff is when you start doing things like, okay, I'm going to use this for my x value, I use this for my y value, now I'll square the value and then give me the square root and that will give me a placement out here, or even stranger calculations. And then, talking about gaming the system, let's introduce some weighting. You know, I really feel that, you know, vulnerabilities are more important than threats. So I'm just going to, I'll weight towards, you know, vulnerabilities. Or I think certain classes of vulnerabilities are maybe more important. Or, you know, this is a pretty common one too, where you do a questionnaire and you're like, well, is this internet facing? It is, oh, multiply by 100. And suddenly, like, anything that's internet facing is immediately a high risk. You know, even if it's just, you know, FTP is open or Finger is open or something really ridiculously, right? Just a port is open, right? So you got to watch out for some of the funky gaming that happens through the use of MathMagic as well. The biggest takeaway I want for you from this one, though, is, again, just start someplace. Get process in place, and then iterate through and improve it over time, right? Don't just assume that you can get to a solid end game right off the bat. It's going to take time. And the reason it's going to take time is because you're going to have to socialize this with the rest of your organization. You're going to have to get buy-in. You're going to have to continue to get buy-in. You're going to have to do a lot of education, training, and awareness. Because not everybody thinks about technical risk in the way that we do. And so you get that process in place, but then you're going to have to start going out there and socializing it. Again, I really recommend leveraging off of ISO 31000 as a general process framework. I think it's very solid. Oh, and by the way, most of the large frameworks are converging on ISO 31000 as their approach anyway. So it just makes sense to do that. And then the last one, again, iterate and evolve, iterate and evolve. This is kind of a DevOps concept, right? Get something out there, get it working, get feedback on it, improve it, repeat, right? So again, don't try to get the perfect process, because you'll never get the perfect process. Get a process in place. Get stakeholders identified. Grow that, mature that over time. So let's talk about triage. Anybody trained in first responder, paramedic, EMT? Take me to the triage process. What's the first thing you check? Yeah, oh, absolutely. Well, he can answer. Somebody else behind you raise their hand too. Is the scene safe? Now what do you check? Scene safe. Next, got a victim on the ground. What do you check? What are the ABCs? No, that's not. That doesn't start with C. Close. Circulation. Right. Airways, breathing, circulation. Triage. You know, can you actually approach the victim on the ground? Are they breathing? If they're not breathing, you should probably address that first. Are they bleeding? If so, address that. Now that you've patched the hole, is it still circulating? Is there actually a good pulse there, or is it really weak? We can do this with most of our risk analyses as well, by developing a handful of convenient factors. And it's going to vary, the specifics will vary by organization. What's important to you? What's important process-wise? What's important in terms of data? What's important in terms of availability and uptime? You'll have to look through these things for your organization. You should be able to come up with a fairly short list. It might be 5 questions, might be 10 questions, might be 2 questions. Using a triage process will help you expedite your overall risk management program and get people moving forward faster, which is a good thing, because the more time that they have to spend waiting for you to do something means that they're going to go off and do something else and probably screw things up in the process, which is how we end up with procurement authorizing cloud purchases, because they're tired of waiting for IT to build the system, right? So for risk management, in order to improve overall decisions, we have to get away from that major delay and say, okay, you're really high risk, so we need to spend some time with you, or, this isn't such a big deal, you can go on, we'll touch back with you in a little bit. This really highlights that for all the talk about formalizing your process, there is a time and a place for informal practices, and that's really, to a degree, what the triaging is about. Now, triage actually needs to be formalized to a degree, right, so you can go through it very quickly. But the goal here is to quickly prioritize, and while keeping it simple, right? People should understand intuitively why you're asking them the questions and what the objective is here, what's the outcome. It should not look like a super complicated machine, right? It shouldn't be Rube Goldberg here doing COBOL programming. Any COBOL programmers out there? I'm sorry for you. Yeah. This isn't what we want, right? Because that leads to bad juju, and we have, builds ill will with people. So we want to get to triage. Now, something we've learned from the DevOps movement, again, is what we call a pace-layered approach. This is a Gartner construct. And what we found is that there tend to be at least 3 types of systems within your organization. Systems of record, systems of differentiation, and systems of innovation. Systems of record tend not to change very quickly. You don't update them. You don't go do your AD every every month, right? You don't just level it and start fresh, right? Your billing, your GL, your APA, RGL systems, your financial, your CRM, your core CRM systems. You don't level those and rebuild them every month, right? These are things that, you look at them every 2 to 5 years, and you hopefully do just incremental patches along the way and not whole-scale changes. For those, we know 2 things. One, looked like one. One, they tend to be pretty doggone important for the organization. Probably going to be a high-risk thing. However, 2, because of the slow pace of change, we can afford to spend more time doing risk assessment with them and helping make better decisions along the way. Now, if you flip up to the top to systems of innovation, those tend to move very quickly. This is where you see a lot of your agile methods or your DevOps shops coming into play, right? If your entire business is built off of web scale, right, and being able to iterate and evolve and produce new features on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis, then you can't say, okay, hold on, time out. You're going to do a new build. I need 2 weeks to do a risk assessment on that. Because the developers are going to laugh at you and be like, but we just finished 20 code pushes in the time that you just told us that sentence. So this allows you to tune your approach accordingly, and you can tie this into your triage approach and say, oh, this is a system of innovation. I don't have the luxury of spending a lot of time here. So quick question, is this dealing with really sensitive stuff that's going to burn us badly? Oh, it's a credit card processing system. Hold on, slow down, call the PMO. I don't care if you're agile or not, or agile fall as some of the shops have been calling it lately. I don't care how fast you think you want to go, development team. You are dealing with highly sensitive data, and no, you cannot test with real data. Sorry. We have to do data masking, data reduction techniques, get that out of there, and we'll assess it accordingly, all right? But this allows you to kind of plug into things a little bit better along the way. The other thing that's interesting, too, is you can use multiple perspectives. So traditionally, we've oftentimes looked at things from a fairly strictly asset-based perspective. How much is the data worth to the business? How much is the system worth to the business? How much does it cost me to recover? That's not too bad overall. But we really want to, you got to be careful with that, right? Because especially if you look at just like infrastructure costs, that doesn't necessarily translate to actual business value, business meaning. You can take that up a level and you can say, okay, well, let's look at this from a business process perspective. Okay, so this is for billing transactions. This is for payroll transactions. This is for e-commerce. This is for B2B, whatever process you want to define. And look at the relative value of that to the business, and then track that back to what are the underlying assets that are involved, and use that to build a correlation. The third basis that you can use is performance basis. And this tends to be a little more abstract and a little harder to potentially document up front, but can be really valuable in the long run. So you say, okay, how does the business function? What's important to the business? If you go to your CEO or the president of your company and say, what's the most important thing? What are the business objectives for the year? What are we trying to accomplish? And they tell you, okay, we want to grow X% for the year. Okay, cool. How do I go now to the business lines and say, okay, how are you contributing to that growth? And how can I enable that within the risk management process? How can I tie that into all of the assessments? So you want to do an IT upgrade on a major system that impacts this line of business. This line of business has a 35% growth target for the year. And if you take them down for 2 days, then they won't achieve that. That could be problematic, right? So using that performance-based approach can be kind of useful. Same goes for uptime, for example. So this can provide a lot of impetus for moving to cloud if you have high uptime requirements, if you want to go to do something distributed, depending on the data that's involved. Recommendation number 4. Now that we've talked about the value of doing informal things, let's talk about something also important, which is making use of the data in your environment. You have data. You have lots of data. Probably have more data than you're even aware of. Find your inner quant. Start doing quantitative analyses, even if it's back of a napkin. All right? FAIR is now an open group standard. You can get to the content and start taking classes and learn about FAIR for next to nothing. No reason not to start thinking about quantitative stuff. So let's slay some dragons. Because there's always, I said quantitative approach, and so there's going to be dragons, right? There be dragons. So there's a lot of mythology around quantitative approaches. And we hear this from all sorts of notable people, including from well-known people who work for institutes like Brookings, who write really ill-informed reports based off of an antiquated notion about risk analysis, quantitative risk analysis. There is no perfect data in the world ever, period, end of story. Anybody disagree? Let's go, come on. Anybody disagree? We don't understand hardly anything when you get right down to it, especially when you start looking at quantum physics, right? There's a lot of unknowns in the world. There is no perfect data. We will never know everything there is to know before we make a decision. If we had to wait for perfect data to make a decision, we'd never make a decision. So how is it that our companies continue to operate? How is it that investments are made, purchases are made? You know, how is this done? How are executives surviving and doing so well if they don't have perfect data? Well, they do the best they can with the data available, right? That's all you can hope for. So from a quantitative risk analysis perspective, the same rule applies. We will never have perfect data. However, if we use estimation and calibration techniques, use those ranges, we can get to a reasonable degree of confidence backed by data that we have a pretty good feel for where certain values will fall. The unknown unknowns argument. Oh, there are scary threats out there that we just don't know about. We just don't know. Here's a problem that I think is very interesting. A lot of people will say this, well, we just don't know what the threats are out there, or we want to take a very threat-centric approach. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. What are you protecting? And it's amazing how many people still today, 2014, don't have an answer for what they're protecting within their organization. Before you get bogged down in the unknown threats and the unknown vulnerabilities, stop and ask the very simple question, what is it that we're protecting? What's important to the business? Because guess what? Even from a quantitative risk analysis perspective, you can make a lot of good decisions based off of what's really important to how the business functions and how you keep the business functioning and growing. And none of that has to be focused on the threats and vulnerabilities out there, primarily. Next one up there, your estimate is bad, also goes along with bad assumptions. There's always room for quibbling, right? That no perfect data thing, right? Again, if you get away from point values, use ranges, do estimation and calibration, you can address some of those problems. You think the data's bad? Fine. Let's sit down and talk about the data. Here's where my data came from. Oh, well, you know, I don't see my industry listed in there. Okay, fine. Well, let's go find data for our industry. Or let's just look at our own records. You got firewall logs, you got server logs, you got application logs, you have all sorts of things going on. You could probably be running vulnerability scans, pen tests, et cetera, right? Lots of data sources. Forget about the industry. Let's look at what you're doing. What's going on in your environment? What's important? And then the last one there, you can't estimate likelihood. Okay. That argument carries some weight to a degree, but you can say within a reasonable degree that, you know, I think a major incident in the next 5 years is probably reasonable for any organization. So how do we work to narrow that down now and get better information around it and say, okay, I don't really want a major event, so what's important? What does that actually mean, major event? And let's track that back to something. So again, this comes to that really big important point, which is there's a lot of data in your organization. Go get it, go use it, and start doing some number crunching. Anybody have high school or college age kids? They like numbers, they like math, they like statistics, they like anything like that? Push them into data science. It is the future. There is so much big modeling going on there already for data scientists. Data scientists are few and far between. Really hard to find good data scientists today. And for all the data that we have out there, it's really difficult to find competent people, like that guy standing over there, who can actually do the crunching and do the analysis and make sense of it all, right? So it's very important to find and build these data science skills within your organizations. And you know, for the folks who have young kids who have potentially an aptitude for math and ops research and stuff like that, suggest that they go that way, because you don't need a degree in computer science today to go do security, right? Or anything IT related. In fact, there's a lot of value in doing something else completely and then coming and bringing those analytical skills in. And being able to do statistical modeling and data science as a data scientist has a lot of potential value going forward for the foreseeable future and beyond. Last slide under this section here, beware of common mistakes. Look before you leap. There's a lot of potential things here. So again, watch out for your assumptions. Make sure you clearly document them. Enlist the support from your subject matter experts, right? So nobody in this room is probably going to be a complete subject matter expert for every domain under risk analysis. You'll probably be really good at the technical estimation, or you'll probably be really good at the business impact estimation. It's very rare for people to have enough grounding in the business to be able to get estimations for both of those camps reliably. And within reason, right? And again, applying that rational filter to things. And some other stuff too. Watch out for fragile and unstable conditions. That's another big one here too. So you think you have a really well-secured system. You look at it and you say, well, it all hinges on this one control or this one stack of controls that all do prevention, no detection, or correction. And if this fails, if we have a failure in this control or in this control stack, we go from really secure to completely insecure. It'd be a fragile condition. The other thing to watch out for is unstable conditions where your estimation is a really huge range. You simply don't know. If you have an incident, you may have very little impact business-wise, or you may have a lot of impact. And really it comes down to a bunch of variables that you just cannot constrain very well. And so that creates what we call an unstable condition within your estimation. So some of the things to watch out for. Again, go in eyes wide open, right? And get training, find the data, start digging, and start doing the modeling yourself. Quit relying on somebody else to tell you what's important to your organization. Start looking what's actually important to your organization and then acting on it. Last major recommendation here, good tools enable good practices. So we talk about process repeatability is very important. Fine, only 5 minutes, really? I can count it on here. Tools help you with that repeatability problem, right? They also help you with gathering data and doing analysis on data. There are a lot of good free tools available. Things like R, for example, for doing statistical analysis. Why would you go out and pay thousands of dollars for a statistical package if you can do it for free on a Linux box with R, right? So there's a lot of things that you can leverage off of. The other thing you can leverage off of are things like GRC. Now what I will tell you is that cultural fit is very important. And this actually applies to the IT risk assessment frameworks as well. So each of the frameworks tends to have a little bit of a different flavor to it. COBIT, very heavily focused on financial services type background, auditor background. Octave comes out of CMU, out of the CERT Risk Resiliency Center. Has a very heavy engineering type flavor to it. Some of the others, like ISF IRAM, has kind of a generic business focus to it. And so looking for that cultural fit is very important for your organization. Don't go grab COBIT and try to slam it down the throat of an educational organization. It's not going to work. And heaven forbid a small business, right? COBIT 5 and onto a small business, you'll crush them under the weight of it, right? On the flip side though, taking something like RiskSafe and throwing it at your financial services organization, Cap 1's in town, right? So a little bit of financial services in the area, probably not the best idea. A really lightweight check the box qualitative assessment probably isn't going to make your regulators very happy, right? So you need to show a good degree of due diligence and reflective, proactive, reasonable decision making that goes into this. So consider the cultural fit when you start building things. And by the way, that cultural fit also applies to how you build those processes out too, right? So if everything stays really centric within your security team or within your IT organization, and you don't go out and involve people from the rest of the organization, you're going to have a hard time getting them to accept that process and buying into that process. And so socialization techniques come into play very importantly here too. Leverage platforms wherever possible. So what do I mean by a platform? Well, you can go buy point tools, and I'm sure security people, you probably have purchased point tools all over the place, right? We need to get away from that point tool mentality, right? Oh, this solves this problem, this very narrow problem. We see this with, I think it's Lifehacker that always talks about this as well, right? You can go buy, 100 kitchen gadgets and fill your kitchen up with all these gadgets when really maybe all you need is a knife and a frying pan, right? Maybe a spoon. So why would you go buy 100 point tools if you can get by with a platform that you can extend to meet your needs? And so that's very key. GRC provides an interesting platform and very useful for aggregating a lot of data, doing dashboard reporting, doing normalization if you have multiple vuln scanners coming in, things like that can be very useful. Again, formalize processes, keep it simple, triage, communicate. Now that last one I think is very important. I haven't really mentioned that much at all. Communication is very, 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 very important. Okay, I think that was enough. If you get the point, right? Communication. If you don't go out and speak to people, if you don't clearly communicate what the expectations are, hey, why are you here? Why are you interrupting my process? Why is this toll gate here? then you're going to have a bit of a problem. So communication is very key. By the way, don't forget about training. If you're going to inject your risk assessment step into the procurement process, you better train people on what that means to them, why it's important, and what they have to do around that. Training might mean classroom training, it might mean hands-on training, it might mean something else altogether. So you have to understand, again, your audience and your culture that you have to fit, and go and fit your training to that. And then, by the way, build some measurements around that so you can evaluate the effectiveness of that training on an ongoing basis. People aren't adhering to the process. Why is that? Why are they breaking out of the process? Well, let's go look at what's going on. What's the breakdown? When's the last time you did training? What's the feedback on the training? Do people understand the training? Do I understand why they're being asked to do something different? Very important to do. And again, lastly, you are what you eat, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So if you're just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and hoping something sticks, that's not a good way to make a decision, not a good way to run an organization. We want to bring in really good data. We want to normalize things. We want to parse for false positives, clean that stuff up before we make decisions, and ratchet down the rhetoric a degree too, I think. So just to recap, there's the 5 recommendations again, and I'll get the slides to the guys here to make them available too. We're probably almost out of time, but we can take a couple questions if anybody wants to throw them out, and I'll be around for the rest of the afternoon as well. I'll post the recommended reading up there, but thank you for your time. Questions, anybody, before they kick me off the stage?